So last time in A Push, we talked about salutary neglect and the fact that the American colonies had absolutely nothing in common with one another. They have different backstories, different economies, different regions, different climates, and in some parts and places, different languages. And by the way, in 1775, all of these colonies come together to try to remove one of the few things that they all share in common: political control by Great Britain. They basically come together to gang up on Mom. And so that's not exactly a recipe for a very durable relationship. There has to be something more to it than that. They have to have other things in common. And so the question is, what? Here are three things that all the American colonies have in common: God, science, and blowing stuff up. God, as in the First Great Awakening, this era of Protestant religious revival that unifies the colonies together in some way. Science, and really we can talk about reason, inquiry, in the form of the American Enlightenment, not to be confused with the European Enlightenment, by the way, and blowing stuff up. The fact that the colonies come together to fight shared adversaries in the form of the French, the Spanish, and their Native American allies. Now, in some ways, the first thing we're going to talk about might be the most powerful force of all, the First Great Awakening. But it's also one of the things that's hardest to detect and measure. So, we're talking about colonial wars. We can point to big battles and peace treaties and territorial exchanges as a way to kind of get a measure of how significant that is. But at some point, if you're talking about religion, you're talking about the hearts and minds and consciences of millions of people. And that's really hard to do and do well. But we're going to try to do it. And I think what's interesting about the story of the First Great Awakening here is that it tells a lot about what makes American history unique and stand out from many of the European powers who created us and colonized us. So if you jump ahead today and look at how Americans treat religion versus many of the Western European nations that are so powerful and so instrumental during this time period, you can see some pretty noticeable differences. So if you go to Europe today, what you tend to notice is that churches like the Church of England in the UK are very large, state-controlled official religions that very few people actively participate in. Churches across Western Europe are, I don't want to, let's say, overstate the case, but they're pretty vacant. Whereas, I mean, the United States is the land of the megachurch, right? And I'm not just unfairly picking two sort of images at the extreme ends of the spectrum. If you look at polling data, you can see a distinct pattern in the way Americans treat religion and the idea of God versus their European counterparts. I mean, if you look at the way, I mean, if you look at this figure right here, if there's anything that really does, let's say, distinguish the United States from Western European countries today, that, you know, usually these are, by the way, the very countries that in many cases colonized us, there's one thing that kind of leaps off the page here. But Americans, statistically, are much, 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 much more likely to believe in God than their European counterparts. But that's not where the story ends. Because if you look at churches like this. Um, so, for example, the Anglican Church in the UK. In Western Europe, you have small numbers of large denominations that very few people participate in on a day to day basis. If you look at the United States today, you have countless numbers of denominations that are very active, at least compared to churches in Europe. And by the way, I'm not trying to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing. And I mean, if you look at mega churches, these are things that are so large you can practically see them from orbit. And that story is something that you could argue is tied to the Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening is also the story of something else that's unique in American religious life, and that is the Tent Revival. The Tent Revival being this traveling group of religious followers who are typically not following a specific denomination. Instead, they're really emphasizing a different way of worshiping. Whereas we kind of think of many churches being a bit like this. But let's just be honest. I mean, I think I see my grandma in here somewhere. We kind of think of these churches as almost being very stuffy and formal. On the other hand, tent revivals are many things, but stuffy and formal are not that. They're supposed to be very emotional experiences where ritual and formality doesn't really come into it. And this is something that we also see in American religious life that we don't really see as much of in Europe. So let's talk about the origins of the First Great Awakening. And the origin is Sir Isaac Newton's universe. Now, no, Sir Isaac Newton was a very accomplished dude, but he did not create the universe. But he basically did more to advance our understanding of how the universe works at a fundamental level than anybody else except for maybe Einstein. And to be honest, you have to know a lot of Newton to understand and appreciate Einstein. So you can still argue that most people, to the extent that they think about the universe at all, still think about it as Newton's universe. So what is Newton's universe? So Newton, for those of you who don't know who Sir Isaac Newton is, you know, the guy who sat under an apple tree, apple fell and hit his head, and he went, egads, this must be gravity. There's obviously a lot more to it, because Newton not only discovered gravity and proved gravity's mathematical existence, he basically figured out everything out about gravity except what it actually is. And apparently the jury is still out on that. There's still no sort of unified cosmological theory on the universe that really explains clearly what gravity is, but we know a lot about it. We know how it impacts the motion of an object, including the planets. And so Newton was able to demonstrate with mathematical precision how planetary bodies move. And he was able to predict where they would be at any given point. And by the way, he basically had to pioneer calculus to prove these things. But the interesting question is that if Newton was able to essentially prove how objects in the universe would move and where they would be, there's one sort of glaring question for people during that time period. If the heavens move mathematically, what does God do? And the issue that Newton had is that even though he's a deeply religious person, he unwittingly discovered a universe that didn't really seem to need God very much, at least from the perspective of many thinkers and intellectuals at the time. So, what we kind of associate with the Enlightenment in Europe is the emergence of this philosophy called deism. For those of you who don't know what deism is the idea that God is almost like this clockmaker, or to modernize it, you can think of God as a programmer who establishes the rules of the universe, or if you like the clockwork analogy, the clockmaker analogy, God winds the universe into existence, but after that exhausting effort, God decides to go on a prolonged lunch break. Is kind of how the theory goes. That God doesn't necessarily take a personal interest in the universe that He created. Um, and so this is a problem for people at the time. I mean, it's still a problem for people now. And that is, how can you have an all powerful God without giving that God room or the flexibility to do all powerful things? Because, again, according to Newton, the universe seems to run pretty well on its own. Now, deism wasn't really like its own separate religion exactly. Deism was more of a philosophical position than a religious one. But deism became increasingly popular among the educated elites in Europe and to a certain extent in colonial America. Some of the founders, most notably individuals like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, had religious and philosophical views that were notably deistic. In other words, God was somebody who was reasonable, who crafted the rules of the universe, but didn't necessarily take a personal interest in the day-to-day occurrences within that said universe. So, what does happen though is that certain deistic ideas or practices or beliefs kind of seep into many of the mainline Protestant churches, it should be said. And so, one of the things that we kind of see in churches like the Anglican Church, or even, shockingly enough, many of the Puritan churches in Massachusetts were very deistic. In other words, they focused on an intellectual view of God rather than an emotional view of God. In other words, a God that was kind of a flesh and blood figure. And, you know, this, you could argue, is something that kind of goes back to one of the core beliefs of Calvinism. Remember that Puritanism is a Calvinist religious ideology. And if you remember, John Calvin was motivated by the fact that God was all powerful, but also humans possessed free will. And so logically, John Calvin came up with the idea of predetermined destination to square away those concepts that seem like they're in let's say opposition to one another. So you could kind of argue that in the Puritan tradition, it is the Puritan tradition is very intellectual, but not necessarily extremely emotional. So this leads us to our discussion of, in a lot of respects, the leading intellectual figure of not just the Great Awakening, but early American history, Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is the least likely person imaginable to lead a religious movement, and furthermore, is the least likely person you would imagine to help establish this precedent. Because in any other time period, Jonathan Edwards would have been a scientist. Edwards was a child prodigy. Um, Basically, he went to Yale University at the age of 13 and graduated first in his class. And so when you go to school or university during that time period, you're not really there for vocational training or to study for a job. And so Edwards basically just wrote papers and articles on everything. He wrote papers on the nature of atoms and rainbows. He wrote papers on existentialism, the anatomy of spiders. I mean, his interests were broad, varied, to a certain extent a little weird, but during this time period, colleges like Yale and Harvard were established to provide uh, theological training for ministers. But you get the impression that Jonathan Edwards really wasn't focused so much on being a minister. He had, like I said, very wide and diverse intellectual interests. Um, but so around the age of 21, he becomes head tutor of Yale. And that doesn't sound too impressive, but it basically means that at 21 years old, at least during that time period, he was running Yale University. I mean, I know that Greystone places a premium on achievement and going as far as you can during your college career. But if you really want to weep, uh, think of Jonathan Edwards. Not only did he enroll in Yale at 13, but by 21 he was basically running the place. And then a relative dies. And because you see, many of these elite Puritan families in New England kind of formed almost pastor dynasties. And Jonathan Edwards was part of one of these dynasties. In 1729, Solomon Stoddard, Edwards's maternal grandfather, died. And Edwards, being one of his, I guess, associate ministers, basically took up his grandfather's posting as being minister of one of the largest and wealthiest churches in all of Massachusetts. Now, basically, you have a young, very intelligent, not too enthusiastic minister who's presiding over a congregation of a bunch of fuddy-duddies. And to Edward's frustration, there is nothing he can really say to get through to them. You also kind of get the impression that Edwards is kind of like the young, charismatic, youth minister with his newfangled rock and roll, trying to impress all the old people who are sort of stuck in their way. So there is that generational element at play. But Edwards was also very frustrated that many of his parishioners, many of the people who went to his congregation, had this very transactional view of religion. And remember that in the Puritan mindset, salvation wasn't really something that was even about faith too much. You were saved because you were a member of the elect. And you realize that if you did certain things, good works, etc., then you can maintain that status of being a member of the elect. And so a lot of Puritan religious life emphasized more proper behavior than proper relationship. And Edwards was also kind of frustrated at the fact that many so-called members of the elect in his congregation seemed to take their salvation for granted. Edwards called them dry bones, by the way, not a compliment. And so eventually Edwards, you get the impression that Edwards is kind of frustrated here, given the fact that he calls his sermon, that you'll actually need to read for one of your primary sources, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This is, of course, Edwards's most famous sermon, but is easy to kind of take out of context. When we see or hear that title, we probably think something like this. Like, this is a good old-fashioned American Protestant hellfire and brimstone sermon. But it's actually not in a lot of respects. Edwards was always this very, I don't want to say soft-spoken individual, but, he was an intellectual. He was not somebody who was too keen on browbeating people one way or the other. Edwards's point is that salvation comes through grace, not through good works. And so the fact that many of his parishioners could sort of take their salvation for granted to Edwards was not just wrong, but also foolish. In Edwards's philosophy, his theology, everybody was a sinner. And so the only way to become a member of the elect, to achieve salvation, required grace from God. Now, what this kind of means is that it's also about personal relationship with God. And remember that Puritan Congregationalist churches believed that there was more, that religion was just as much a community thing as much as an individual thing. And you had quote unquote weirdos like Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson who believed that it was about, it's about the individual, it's about relationship. And remember, they were Puritan shunned. You could say that Jonathan Edwards is kind of a continuation of that old debate, the old anti-Nomianism debate in Puritan New England. But this time, the message kind of caught on. And so many historians kind of argue that Jonathan Edwards establishes the theological underpinning of the First Great Awakening, where it's not about what people think or believe so much as what they feel and what they do. At the end of it all, though, Edwards is just one guy. He's a brilliant guy, but he's just a guy who kind of has the personality of a college professor who also is a pretty good minister and comes up with intellectually and theologically and emotionally engaging sermons. But again, just one guy. For his ideas to actually spread beyond his congregation and indeed beyond Massachusetts, you need somebody who can take his show on the road. And that person is George Whitefield. George Whitefield is, I think, one of the most interesting characters in the first, or like the early part of American history. And certainly by the time of the War of Independence, George Whitefield was the most famous person in colonial America. And there was a pretty big reason for that. And that's because he was an evangelist who arrived in colonial America in 1739 and practically spent every waking moment for the better part of the next several years preaching. So apparently he delivered over 18,000 sermons on American soil from Maine all the way to Georgia. And not only was he well traveled, but also the guy had lungs. We might think of public speaking as being being about word choice, as being about eloquence and pitch and tone and logos and ethos and pathos. And what we sometimes forget is that a lot of public speaking before the 20th century was simply about how long you could talk in a loud speaking voice without your voice giving out. Now, here's the amazing thing about Whitefield. We know that Whitefield could preach to over 20,000 people at a time without requiring any additional amplification. So you may remember a few lectures back where I mentioned that Philadelphia was the largest city in colonial America. What was the population? Oh, about 20,000 people. What that means is that George Whitfield could go anywhere in colonial America and make himself heard. And apparently, everybody had some kind of memory of George Whitfield, whether you're talking about religiously devoted people or skeptics. The fact is that by the War of Independence, most of the colonial population that was born in the mid 18th century had some kind of memory or reflection of George Whitfield, including religious skeptics like Benjamin Franklin. Um, so it's hard to know what effect Whitfield had because from what I understand, it's not that he was a great intellectual or a great wordsmith. He just had this unnatural charisma. And he even persuaded Benjamin Franklin a little bit. Again, not really known for being incredibly devout. So listen to the words of Franklin, who was attending Whitfield's revival near Philadelphia. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistoles in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften, and concluded to give him the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. And that is from a learned religious skeptic. And Ben Franklin is practically shoveling money into the offering plate. It's hard for us to know what he did or um, what he said to make people uh, be so moved, but we know he was remarkably successful at it. He never planned out his sermons. He winged everything, but he winged stuff for 3, 4 hours at a stretch, and supposedly he could make people break down and weep just from the way he pronounced Mesopotamia. I mean, I don't know. I really feel passionate and emotional about the River Valley civilizations like ancient Sumer and Babylon, but I don't think I've ever gotten anybody to cry, including myself, over them. So I don't know how he did it, but he did it. And this emotional style is something that is kind of mimicked by almost every tent revival preacher since the mid 18th century. And not only did he travel around the country emphasizing relationship with God, uh, but he also ministered to people that nobody really cared about. He ministered to the new Scots, Irish, and German immigrants, but also really some of the first for the first time in colonial American history, um, George Whitfield was very known for evangelizing to slaves. And if you remember, slave masters, the planters, had a very uncomfortable feeling about evangelizing slaves because, to a certain extent, in early American history, what distinguished slaves from non slaves was religion, at least at first, before Bacon's Rebellion. But now what happens is in the 18th century, suddenly planters who kind of get wrapped up in this wave of religious euphoria give their blessing for their slaves to be converted to Christianity. Not all of them do, but many of them do. I said the First Great Awakening brings uh, the American colonies together. And it has to, because what else could bring slave owners and slaves together but something as ground changing as the First Great Awakening? So, also the fact is that his messages didn't really, um, they weren't very denominational. And remember that throughout European and American history, denominations are huge things. In Europe, to a certain extent, they're still killing each other over denominational differences. People like Anne Hutchinson, remember, were banished from Massachusetts Bay over minor doctrinal differences and disputes that sometimes come up in denominations. The fact that we can kind of laugh about denominational differences is a luxury afforded to us by the fact that we don't live in the 17th or early 18th century. But then you have Whitefield. Whitefield is an Anglican, a church that is probably the most deistic of all Protestant churches, and he comes with this heavy hitting, very emotional style. He's the most un Anglican you can imagine. And maybe for precisely because of that reason, his message transcends denominational lines. And so Whitefield isn't just ministering to other Anglicans, he's ministering to Calvinists. He's ministering to churches from all over the colonies. And so, very quickly, what happens is that if there are more differences within denominations than between denominations, what do denominations really mean? And this is a uniquely American thing, I would say. Denominations are still very powerful forces today in Europe. But the First Great Awakening starts to erode those denominational boundaries. What happens is that in almost every major denomination, whether you're talking about the Congregationalists, the Anglicans, um, whatever, you have what's called Old Light churches. These are more traditional churches who favor less emotional styles of worship. And then you have New Light churches who are the revivalists. These are churches that are very often on the Western frontier. And again, they favor more emotional styles of worship. Um, so, what this also kind of helps lead to is for those of you who have ever heard of the Methodist Church, the Methodist Church is in the United States today. I think it's the largest um, denomination, at least in terms of percentages. At least, sorry, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. The Methodist Church is kind of created out of this sort of revivalistic atmosphere. It's something that emerges in the UK and led by John Wesley. But the First Great Awakening is specifically George Whitefield is strongly associated with the origin of the Methodist Church. So the legacy here for the First Great Awakening is this atmosphere of ecumenism. That's a really fancy word. Ecumenism is related to the word ecumenical. In other words, if you've never heard of the word ecumenical, it means it kind of transcends denominations. Again, if there are more differences within denominations than between denominations, then those denominational labels don't really matter as much. Again, there is this renewed emphasis on evangelism, and the idea of going out and enthusiastically converting people to Christianity. But it's also not just about converting people; it's reconverting people, because most of the individuals who were emotionally swayed by the First Great Awakening were already Christians to begin with. But this prompted them to deepen their faith and to consider a more personal relationship with God. Now, this third point is maybe the most interesting of all, but it's also the hardest to quantify. So, many scholars of the American Revolution discuss the impact that religion had on the revolution itself. One of those historians was King George III himself. King George III characterized the American Revolution as a Presbyterian revolution. He, according to Old Georgie, the conflict itself wasn't between Whigs or Tories or Republicans and monarchists. The conflict was about was one between Anglicans and Presbyterians. I don't know that you could accept George III as an authoritative source on the American Revolution, but the fact that even people during that time period noticed these religious tremors, I think is kind of interesting. Um, so you do have this emphasis on individualism, partially because if denominations don't really matter, if to a certain extent, if not even ministers matter, if religion is a purely individualistic thing, and there's an emphasis on this emotional relationship that you can have with the creator of the universe, that it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you can talk to the creator of the universe, then what does that mean for your relationship with your earthly king or your earthly sovereign? If we're emphasizing individualism in all things, shouldn't that transcend into politics? Interestingly, when we get to the Enlightenment, we're going to talk about the fact that many European and American Enlightenment thinkers were emphasizing individualism for very different reasons, but it's a lot of those same that same type of thinking. The individual is paramount. So that's the Great Awakening. It ensures that no one denomination holds a monopoly over colonial American religious life, and I would say that its consequences can still be felt today. I mean, if you look at like the size of congregations, of denominations in the United States, you'll notice that no one church, with maybe the exception of the Catholic Church, has or claims anywhere close to a majority of the Christian population. On the other hand, if you look at European churches, and I'm just going to ballpark here, the vast majority of Christians in the United Kingdom are members of the Anglican Church. The vast majority of Christians in France are members of the Catholic Church. The vast majority of Christians in Sweden are members of the Church of Sweden. You have small numbers of really large churches that very few people actually attend. In the United States, you have very large numbers of denominations that are really small that a lot of people attend. And one of the reasons that the First Great Awakening is important is that it's not just an opportunity for us to continue talking about theology. It's the fact that generally every generation in American history, you see some great big religious event, some kind of revival that, in a lot of respects, copy pastes or outright plagiarizes the time, like the sequence of the First Great Awakening. You have religious revival that takes place on the frontier. You have this general sort of revival among most Protestant churches, and then what inevitably happens is that this revival peters out. But that being said, when people start questioning their relationship with God and the universe, everything else, they also start to reconsider their own system of values and their morality. So, is it a coincidence that you have the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, and then about 30 years later, you have the American Revolution? Is it any coincidence that in the 1820s and 30s, you have a Second Great Awakening, and about 30 years later, you have the American Civil War. It might be a coincidence. There's no formula to suggest that American religious revivals always lead to catastrophic or apocalyptic events like big wars or that kind of thing. But what we can kind of say is that religions are very good at getting people to question their values. And once you start getting people to question those values, there are very often political consequences. Maybe not immediately, but in the long term, that's typically what happens. And so, whenever you hear that there is some kind of religious awakening in um, American history, that's not necessarily significant because we're going to talk about theology. It's significant because these awakenings are sometimes the canaries in the coal mine. These are things that tell us maybe not that something is going wrong, but that big things are about to happen in American politics. And over time and throughout history, that relationship has been borne out time and time again. Next time, we will discuss the American Enlightenment, which, even though is about science and reason, one of the things you'll see is that in a lot of ways, it doesn't work against the ideas of the First Great Awakening, but in many ways, it complements them. I will see you guys then.